I see.
That's great. Wonderful.
Good morning, everybody. Good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for your patience as we got set up here in the room. This is the Fairbank Center's scholars presentations about Taiwan studies, and we're pleased to see you all online. Linda, would you like to
Sure.
start?
Sure. So welcome, everybody. We're really excited that you were all able to show up early in the morning and late in the evening. For those of you who are online, David Wang, wonderful to see you in Taiwan. Thank you all for joining. I'm Dinda Elliott. I'm the executive director of the Fairbank Center. And Harriet Wang really gets all the credit for putting together this today's presentation. But we're really excited to have our 3 Taiwan scholars presenting this morning. And it's been so wonderful. You know, at the end of the year, I just want to say how wonderful it's been to have you all here throughout the whole year, sharing your research and your ideas with our broader community. And you've just brought so much to the table. So thank you for all of that all year long. Especially thrilled to have Steve Goldstein here this morning also. So thanks for being here, Steve, the convener of the Taiwan Studies Workshop. So we're going to start. Any other formalities that we need to talk about before we begin?
No, just that they're short presentations. So
Yeah.
we have a little bit of time for Q&A.
Right. So the presentations are, let's see, how long is each one is about 20 minutes, something like that?
Yeah.
Is that about right?
15 to 20.
15 to 20 minutes. Okay, wonderful. So we're going to start with Ruochen, who's our family pre-doctoral fellow in Taiwan studies, and she's going to be talking about Edward Yang and education, focusing particularly on the film A Bright Summer Day from 1991. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Dinda, for the introduction. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank Dinda and Harriet for all the organizational effort and for putting all the workshops together and for the correspondences that we've had before too. And thank you everyone for coming here. It's very early here and it's very late in East Asia. So I really appreciate that you'd rather be here than anywhere else. So I am, in cinema studies, and more specifically, I work at the intersection between film and philosophy. So the discipline of film philosophy, it kind of, it explores how films, in a manner that is specific to their medium, how they contribute to the discussions and thinking about fundamental philosophical questions. So underlying this approach is kind of awareness of the importance of this idea called medium specificity. And I'll just maybe talk a bit more about that. So for example, if we think about philosophical questions such as, what is knowledge? What is reality? Do we have access to that reality? Or what counts as a good and responsible ethical life? Or more specifically about education, right? How do we think about the nature of education? Does society have a role in kind of moderating or cultivating youth and young people's moral character? Or does education just kind of stop when we turn 22 and we're done with school? Of course, PhD students are a bit different. Or is it a lifelong process that it keeps going? But if that's the case, what are the practical implications for that? So if we think about all of these questions, we can approach it differently, right? Sometimes we could read a philosophy book, a philosophical treatise that's written by Aristotle or Kant or Hegel. Or sometimes we can read a great novel, a great literature by Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, or Cao Xie. But you can imagine that the kind of philosophizing that these texts do might be a bit different. So the same goes with films. I think the best films that kind of have the highest artistic values really take all of these questions very seriously, because they're not that far from us. As student, as a child, as parent, as teachers, we confront these questions all the time. There are decisions to be made, actions to be taken. So these films kind of depict thinking about these questions in a very particular manner. And that is what film philosophy tries to pay attention to. So it's not just about questions, but it's about how questions are raised and how they are thought about. And so, this field, as you can imagine, has so far been concerned with mostly Western films and Western filmmakers. And I think that people like Edward Yang Chen, his status as a Taiwanese filmmaker has so far masked his relevance to the discipline. And so my project in general, by incorporating, aesthetic, ethical, educational philosophies to reading his films, really try to, bring seemingly divergent discourses into productive conversations, and really try to show the relevance of Chinese media and texts to the discussions of contemporary and also classical Western philosophical theories. And so I am working on this person, Edward Yang, and he is quite important in Taiwan. Actually, there's an exhibition that's giving to a retrospective given to him this July. So you can see that the importance of him is being more visible, and I'm very happy to learn about that. So he is also, if you can go to the next slide, he's a figure so part of the leading figures in the 80s, a movement called Taiwan New Cinema, Taiwan Xing Dianying. If there's time in the Q&A, I can talk a bit more about the background here, but you can see Hou Xiaoxian, Yang Dechang, and Wu Mianzhen, so people might be more familiar with them. And next slide, please. So he has made, several films, 7 feature-length films, and the most famous one might be this one, EE, made in the year 2000. And the English translation goes EE, a 1 and a 2. You can see why here. So the character E and the 2. And the other very famous film by him is, if you could go to the next slide, what my presentation is going to be on today. A historical epic made in the year 1991 called A Brighter Summer Day. This film is 4 hour long, and he tends to make long films, but this is definitely the longest one. And so the presentation today is a very small part of one of my dissertation chapters that examines primarily this one film. And if you could go to the next slide. So what I want to show, if you just click one, is that one of the things that I think is so central to Edward Yang's concerns and approach has been so far very much overlooked in contemporary scholarship, and it is his overwhelming concern with education. And if you could keep going. So I argue that Edward Yang goes beyond a mere criticism of the problems of conventional and repressive forms of education, which hinge on the idea of commensurability, I will talk more about that, of all thoughts, knowledge, and subject positions. So going beyond that, if you could click again, he actually stages a specific kind of aesthetic education for the audience, so for us, with the end goal of cultivating in us the ability to see, to understand, and to live with incommensurability, which is a term that just describes the absence of a common measure. And if we take it a bit more broadly, a common language sometimes is absent, a common framework of thinking sometimes is absent between different entities. So for example, it could be mathematical or geometric magnitudes, or it could be between desires, could be between social positions, or it could be between ideals. And just to be a bit more concrete, so if you could go to the next slide. So I know that the term incommensurability sounds a bit foreign and maybe scary, but we all know it. So the relationship, for example, between the circumference to the diameter is an incommensurable one, because they cannot be, that relationship, the ratio cannot be expressed in the whole number, multiples of a shared unit. So we know that, that relationship is pi, which is an irrational number, and the irrational and the incommensurable are very much close together in ancient Greek. And so here's another example. So given a square, its diagonal to its side is of an incommensurable relationship because it's square 2 and this is 1. So we know that, the square root of number 2 is an irrational number. And so on the basic idea, this is the incommensurable things between things having no common measure in, for example, geometry. But if we think about it, there are values. So we take it broadly. For example, freedom and equality. They sometimes, sure, we can espouse those values, but when they're carried out, there are a lot of complications, right? And they could become incommensurable with each other. And then what do we do then? So that's the question that I'm trying to think about. So if you could go to the next slide. And so my project so I want to suggest that underlying a lot of our Young's stylistic experimentation is a consistent use and exploration of the so-called formal incommensurables. So the perceptual ones between, for example, a juxtaposition between a line and a circle, or between sounds. And I just want to show you some brief examples that I see just within this one film. And you can see that, so the clip that we're about to watch in just a bit starts from basically here when the scene ends. And you can see that there is a mathematical or geometric shape on the blackboard. So presumably they just ended a math class and they're about to start a Chinese class. And he's erasing this diagram, which contains incommensurable magnitudes. But if you want to say that, well, that might just be a coincidence, it doesn't mean much by it, it's overreading. So if you could go to the next slide. So this is one of the very interesting moments in the film, and the person is kind of walking in the dark hallway. And you can see that, the arcs, on the outside, because the moonlight or streetlights are shining in, you really see that the juxtaposition between the curves and the grids of the windows, it's very present. And those things kind of comment on certain relationships or the internal struggles that the characters actually are having at the moment. So next slide. And also, so this is the opening shot of the entire film. It's marvelous. It's almost 3-minute long take. The camera just stays there. Nothing happens. I think it's 2 minutes and 47 seconds. But you can see what it's doing, right? The trees, they kind of form just gigantic, beautiful curves, arcs, on top. And then we see the streets forming straight lines. And then eventually, you can't see it now, but the protagonist and his father are going to be riding their bikes toward us in the scene. And we can see that the people inside this frame are kind of working as straight lines that's juxtaposed against, the curves on top. So those are just some examples. And if you could, another, I think what I call formal incommensurables is this use of sound. And specifically, it's the on-screen and off-screen sound. And I will explain what that means. So for example, there's a conversation scene that is going on here. He's talking to someone, and we know that he's talking to someone, but we don't see him, right? And so in the conversation, we hear the dialogue, but we don't see his body. So we call that an off-screen sound because he is off-screen. And actually, the protagonist is right here. He's not shown to us. So, we must ask, what is going on, right? Why is the important stuff being hidden from us? So it's things like that I really try to pay attention to. And if you could just go to the next slide. So maybe just a bit of context about where the film or like what the setting of the film is. So very similar to Hou Xiaoxian's 悲情城市, which was a film made in 1989. It's also a kind of a history film. Both films trace kind of the life and development of a family with 4 children in Taiwan and at a very critical historical period. So in the 1950s and 60s, Taiwan witnessed a major demographic shifting, right? With so there is a huge wave of emigration of the mainlanders with the KMT, the Kuomintang's relocation to Taiwan. And so and that kind of creates what a Taiwan scholar Hong Guojun, a Duke, calls the dichotomous categories of 本省人, the native Taiwanese, versus the 外省人, the immigrant mainlanders. And so in addition to this, there is a widespread paranoia that is the result of the political oppression from Kuomintang, which sets up a police state under martial law, and the martial law itself was only lifted in 1987. So against this huge backdrop of the political bleakness that is the part of the period of the White Terror period, the and against the demographic shifts, Edward Young chooses to kind of focus on the secondary education and also family life in Taipei at the time. And the title, so we saw the Chinese title of the film, 古岭街少年杀人事件. It basically just gives you the plot and the climax. We know exactly what happens at the end. Indeed, the climax is about that. So this is just another detail that really separates Edward Young from conventional filmmaking, in that he doesn't care about the lure of cheap suspense, right? It's not just about what's going to happen in the film that he cares about. It gives you what's going to happen. So everything else matters. But so in the film, he also tells people with a title part that the whole film is based on a real murder event by a teenager that took place on June 15th, I believe, in 1961. So at the turn of the 60s. And the news, of course, shocked the nation at the time. So I think for the sake of time, but it might be very nice for us to have a concrete example so that we can see how these things exemplify the kind of things I consider as aesthetics of incommensurability that Edward Young gives, and it really contributes to our thinking of aesthetic and ethical education. So the scene that we're about to watch, it sets up a classroom dynamic between a teacher and the student, and it epitomizes the kind of inequality in institutional oppressive education that is widely present. Maybe before, more so in Chinese societies, and also maybe East Asia, at large. So, but I want us to kind of think about maybe the formal elements of it. So how he shoots this is especially efficient in actually presenting the people on screen, the teacher and the student, their relationship as incommensurable. But not only that, he actually gives us an alternative pedagogy. But I will talk more about that after we watch the
Not having success with giving.
maybe if we just do it before. Yeah, just the comment. It's not ideal, I guess. But yeah, I'm going to click it again. Yeah, but that's fine. Sorry, the sound is not that good because the recordings. So very interesting clip here. You know, so obviously, if the teacher actually is invested in this question, which is an absurd question to begin with, which language is better and what criteria of judgment should we use to determine this question? Then Wang Mao, the student, his answer should be a prime occasion for further discussion and reflection, right? They should talk it out. But of course, he's not concerned with, you know, the pursuit of truth or wisdom here. He's concerned with his own explicatory position because it's being threatened right now. He is unable to provide an answer to the student's question, and he can't have the final say in this exchange. So what does he do? He resorts to absolute power or absolute force. So in this case, by making the student do whatever he tells him to do. And also, most importantly, in front of others. So it's a clear classic discipline and punishment example. And so other people know that, well, there's a boundary, you don't cross it so easily, you stay within it. And this way, authority is safeguarded. And you can see that the political illusion is very obvious here as well. But so let's come back to so if you just go to the next slide. This question, right? And not the teacher's one, but Wang Mao's, the student's question. What about me, or what about I? 那我呢? So I think this question does not only have to be taken contextually, referring to the character itself, which we see him writing, but literally. So we must ask, along with Edward Young, what about the student in the education? You know, what kind of role should he play? And what rights and obligations should be accorded to the student? And so I think the question itself is already suggesting a student-centered pedagogical approach. But another thing that I really want to point out, so you could just keep going. I'm skipping these two slides, some theoretical discussions of education, but if you could go to the next one. I think it's very interesting how the conversation is shot. So conventionally, a conversation is shot by what we call shot reverse shot. So look at here. You see a conversation, you see person A first, and then you switch to a shot of person B, who is talking. And so this back and forth, we call it a shot reverse shot. But in the scene, if you remember, the camera stays with the student, and there is no visual entrance of the teacher into this. So by staging the dynamic this way, I think Edward Young is giving a kind of cinematic response to what is going on. So the camera assumes a role and responsibility that's denied by the teacher. So the teacher asks the question, right? He feigns humility by saying that, okay, 对这个问题你有什么见解, right? And translated as, oh, you have something to add, which is pretty mild. But we know that he doesn't think that the student has anything to offer. He probably just thinks that, well, student is not paying attention. He will say something embarrassing. People will laugh at him. That's his purpose. But the camera stays with the student, indeed inviting him to say what he thinks. And so in this exchange, so that's one that kind of supports the student-centered pedagogy. But the other thing is that by putting them into the same space, so we hear the teacher's voice, right, and the teaching that is going on. They're in the same space, but putting the teacher through give him to us through voice only, through sound, but give us the student through visuals. If you could just go to the next slide. I think it's very important that he preserves a kind of spatial unity and a formal heterogeneity. There's a lot more analysis to this, but I just want to quickly point that out. But if you remember from the previous slide, the space between the two people who are talking was dissected, right? They're basically in literally different space. But here we have both of them in the same space audially, but then we see his visual versus, the teacher's sound. So I think this kind of detail.
I don't know why my thing isn't working.
Is it plugged in?
Yeah,
What thing are you talking about?
my earphone, my earbuds.
It should be working.
Sorry.
So it really creates a complex web of incommensurable worlds. So to begin with, there is English and Chinese, which is a really poignant reminder of the American presence in the 60s Cold War Pacific area period. And then we have the world between the teacher and the student, which I focus on mainly. But to put it alternatively, it could be between the adult and the teenager, or it could be between a person who has political and social power versus a person who must obey. So, but by putting things this way, I think it's really effective in kind of showing us that what the teacher, finds as the appropriate means and ends of education, and what the student actually needs are at complete odds with each other, namely incommensurable. And their respective capacities, desires, obligations, they talk past each other. And so, of course, there are a lot of other examples in the film and in his other films too. But we don't have that much time to go into them. But I think it's things like this, by putting these complex, difficult relationships together, these scenes demand these relationships to be rethought and reimagined. And I think the kind of perceptual training that Edward Young's films in general give us also compel us to kind of work toward a togetherness that really sees, acknowledges, and does justice to difference. Thank you so much.
Well, do we have time for a couple of questions? Like
Very quick, short ones.
Yeah,
Quick,
sorry.
quick,
So
quick.
I tried to cut a lot for it.
Well, I'll jump in with a super quick one. Firstly, thank you. That's just so fascinating to hear you, as a non-film person and a non-art person, to have you dissect, the sort of meaning of the shapes that we're looking at, and the space and the sound is just incredible. But I'm really curious as to whether, when this film came out, was it seen as a political film? In other words, was he, of course you can interpret what he's saying in many different ways.
Yeah.
But one of those ways is that it seems like it's pretty clearly sort of criticizing society and socio-political dynamics, and,
Yeah.
In a kind of a clever way.
Yeah.
So was it seen as being political at the time?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. So I just want to point out a fact. For example, the martial law was lifted in 1987,
Yeah.
right? And this film came in 1991, clearly after that. And also Hou Xiaoxian's film, which deals even more explicitly with the RRT 事件, the 227 thing, it also came in 89.
Yeah.
So clearly, the lifting of the martial law creates a space that these directors thought that this is the proper time to really reflect on history and really do it in a kind of creative, but also does it justice. So for Edward Young, I think he's very concerned. The 3 films that he made before this are all set in urban Taipei. And so this is a kind of anomaly in his entire corpus that is not an urban, modernized society. But I think for him, it's very important to go back to the 60s, because he feels that there is a very direct connection in thinking back on what the 80s and the 90s going into that the 60s could teach us about. So I think the political aspect is just a very fascinating thing, because it's not overtly obvious, but it's very much present. And I think that's the fun part about this film. There is depictions of, for example, torture, but in a very non-obvious way. Yeah.
Maybe one more question before we move on. Any questions online or?
I think Professor Lee has a question.
Professor Wang, do you have a question?
Oh,
Lydia, please go ahead with your question. We can hear you, I think.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Richard. Thank you so much. This is a really enjoyable presentation. I wanted to let you know that I think Harvard Film Archive is going to be doing an Edward Young retrospective in November. So his work is very much celebrated continues to be celebrated, especially in the sort of international art house circles. And I was kind of wondering about the comparative dimension. I found that clip that you showed to be really intriguing. It's been a long time since I watched A Brighter Summer's Day. late, but I teach another film that was made a couple of years later in China by Jiang called, In the Heat of the Sun. And there's a scene in that film where it's also sort of a critique
Yeah,
of.
well, I haven't had my breakfast, so I think I'm gonna.
I'm also reminded of the 400 Blows, the French New Wave film Truffaut. So there's sort of a series of films that are about adolescents in classrooms and being oppressed by these authoritarian figures. And I'm just wondering what you find to be like, whether you have also made these kinds of comparisons, or you feel like this type of film is very particular to Taiwan, the specificity of it. And the other element, this is more of a comment rather than a question, is your analysis of the shot reverse shot. I appreciated that kind of formal analysis, and I thought that it's interesting that the teacher is not shown, and oftentimes the authoritarian voice is often only heard and never seen. Sometimes they're even coming over loudspeakers or coming over some kind of mediated format, and it's often appears in a very rather oppressive form. And you also hear this in films such as City of Sadness, where the authoritarian voices are always coming over the loudspeakers and over the radio, and you never see the person speaking in a way. So maybe that formal decision is very deliberate. So, but I'm kind of curious about whether you're comparing this film to other films about sort of adolescents who are rebelling against authority in other contexts.
Thank you so much for the questions and suggestions. And I totally just to respond to the second part of the what you were saying, is that I do think there is something that is about disembodied voice that really makes it, conducive to a kind of, officiality and also force that, when we don't see it, it becomes even more mysterious and it becomes even more powerful. Just for example, when we're in a dark room and if we hear any sound, it becomes very scary, right? So I think definitely what you're saying is there. And I definitely remember the radio voice in the City of Sadness as well. But so coming back to the comparative, I'm so glad that you mentioned In the Heat of the Sun, 阳光灿烂的日子 by Jiang. I thought that there are a lot of similarities between the two films as well. I think there was like a game, youth game, in 阳光灿烂的日子 as well. And the film, Jiang's film is also, it's a bit postmodern in terms of the narrative. So I think that's also a kind of interesting formal kind of deliberation on his part. So between the two films, I think just on top of my head, there are two things that could stand out. And one is kind of like postmodern narrative versus what I think Edward Young is doing. That is
story of a park visitor who gets to
maybe less about what Jameson describes as postmodern, but actually more modernist, more classical in his kind of formal choice. And the other thing is that Edward Young was an engineer for many years, and I think he has a very just peculiar sensitivity to mathematical logic and geometric shape that is not commonly shared by many directors. So that's why, I really want to focus on just the formal composition that he really does. And he is, notorious for his demanding of every detail being right, and bad temper on set. So all of those things, but the 400 Blows, and there are many others, I think, so that reminds me of, just what I take as kind of new wave movements, the French New Wave, so the Truffaut 400 Blows that you just mentioned. And I think in Japanese New Wave as well, even in kind of Hollywood Renaissance, there is this primary concern with education about youth. And I think that's something for a long-term goal that I really want to work out more on. I've kind of taught courses that put different films from different regions together about this theme. So, but thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And what a fantastic. Okay, so very excited that next up we have Nan-Hsu Chen, who is our Ho family postdoctoral fellow in Taiwan studies, and he is going to talk about everyday problems and wartime transportation in Taiwan, 1884 to 1885. Welcome.
Thank you first for I would like to take this opportunity to
express my appreciation for the Fairbank Center and also the support and the great intellectual environment I encountered here. And today's presentation is my second article on my long-term project about the resources transportation and its relation to Taiwan's history and Qing China. So the last semester I present the transportation of global resources into the Qing Empire. And today I will shift my focus to the local society a little bit. So could you skip to the next slide? So I would like to invite you to think about this question. So what did people do during a war? And today I take the example of the Sino-French War of 1884 and 85. The next two. The next slide, please. Yeah, so let me give you the stories of two people. So one is the Hsinchu County Magistrate Hong De-Sun. So there's a small county in northern Taiwan in 1884. So he became the county magistrate. So what did he do? So at that time, he arranged, tried to help recruit 4,600 porters in order to transport all the shipments in support of the war on the island of Taiwan. So to that, the number means that every other day, Hong has to arrange porters to provide such a service. And this kind of run on a daily basis. So it's not only about the transportation, it's about the communication with the military in terms of when any problem arises. Another person called Tsai, Hsinchu's headquarters. I will talk about the institution of headquarters shortly, but basically the person will do the actual recruitment for the county magistrate. And Porter Tsai, although war is about the war, but actually Porter Tsai, what he does during this time is act like a detective, try to locate any missing items on the island and make a report to Magistrate Peng, and Peng will make a report to his subordinates. So here we can see there's a wide range of experience during the war and a wide range of ways that people became involved in a war that involving Taiwan and other countries. So I think I will ask this question: why does this matter to people in the 21st century? So I think in one modest way that the stories I'm going to tell tells us that local conditions matter to even some grand historical events. And people became involved in a specific manner because of their roles, their titles, and because of their personal circumstances and structural factors like local institutions, local practices existing before the war. So that's why there's a fruitful way to think about a war by thinking about what goes before the war actually taking place. So could you go back to the previous 3 slides? So the case study is the Sino-French War in Taiwan. So very briefly, this is a war fought between the Qing Empire and France, because the France expanded its influences in today's Vietnam in the 1870s. But in 1884 and 85, the two empires, China and France, become engaged in armed conflict. And the war was not only happened in Southwest China, but also affecting Taiwan. And here's a list of landmark events. So China sent its Imperial Commissioner Liu Mingchuan to Chia-hung in northern Taiwan. It's a small harbor in northern Taiwan to arrange local defense. So in August 5th and August 23rd, the French attacked 2 major ports in northern Taiwan, Chia-hung and Nan-Hsu. So this is kind of a large scale armed conflicts. But nevertheless, Qing armies successfully defended the island, And on the 20, next slide, please. So then the French shift its strategy, besieging the island, and kind of the war gradually enter into a phase of stalemate. So the Magistrate Pong took his office in the next year, January 22nd, took his office at this time and became involved in the war, especially about wartime transportation. And the first batch of Qing reinforcements landed southern Taiwan, especially in the Taiwan prefecture. So this is a context why Magistrate Pong has to be part of their transportation effort, assisting like the troop moving towards north, where the French were, and also assisting the transportation of military supplies. And later this year, in June 9th and 21st, the war came to a close. So basically, the story occurred during the happened year during that time. Next slide, please. So there's a vast body of research on the history of Sino-French War. Next slide, please. And I think there are a lot of a few ways that we can reinterpret the history from a different angle. And I think in short, the angle will be, let's look at the local society and the local government in order to understand like an international event. So when we look at the local archives, then we found that actually we can see what I call another battleground. So a war is not about fighting between the troops, the armies, but it could be between the civil officials and military officials in terms of like wartime reimbursement, about the problems arising from the logistic transportation, etc. And Qing military transportation, if we look the study of military transportation, the late 19th century was very different from the mid-Qing or early Qing, because in this time, the armies dispatched to major provinces and frontiers were provincial armies. In short, they were less supervised by the central government, enjoy certain autonomy. And lastly, enabled by local archives, we can see the transportation underground. I understand that in the 19th century, transportation is underground, but here I mean that what is really going on at the locale where the transportation took place. Next slide, please. So the material for this research is Danshin archives. So this is a collection of county government archives stored in northern Taiwan in the late 19th century. So although there are thousands of county governments in the 19th century, but only a handful of them, their archives are still accessible nowadays. But this is one of them, and it is quite accessible. So in order to, so there are a lot of ways that things could go wrong during a war. And the first reason is that what I call the relay transportation and the missing items. So Magistrate Pong spent much energy not about the war efforts, but about arguing with military officials. And the reason is laid in what I call relay transportation. So at the time, for whatever reason, the military troops sent to Taiwan, they relied county governments to transport equipment, belongings, etc. But the way is particular. So each county government, there are several county governments in Taiwan. Each county government hired a group of porters to transport those items across the jurisdiction. And they turn the commodities or goods shipments to the next group of people, next group of porters hired by another county. So now you can imagine everything could go wrong when you change hands, right? So this is kind of a structural problem. But you would say, okay, there's an institution that they will have to, county government have to issue receipt or get receipt from his counterparts to prove that we have successfully delivered those commodities. And this is one of the receipts. So, but in reality, it's not so easy, because one example magistrate encounter is that he tries to inspect the items. So the items, in the end, there were 120 wooden boxes. She tries to examine the items, but he found that those boxes were gone and being replaced by big bags, so gunny sacks. So he asked the military personnel, and the military personnel says that there's nothing wrong, so we cannot let you to inspect those items. So you see the county magistrate, he has to interact with the military commanders who refuse to be inspected. And in the end, there are the rifle bullets just went missing, and each county magistrate blame each other, try to say that those items went missing in their jurisdiction instead of my jurisdiction. And so that creates a lot of problems. Next slide, please. So then if you look at deeper, then you will ask why those items went missing in the first place, instead of blaming the relay system. So then we have to look at those porters who were hired to transport those items. So here in Hsinchu and in many other counties as well, they were head porter. So basically they were government contractors. They hire porters for the government, but it's not so easy, it's not so simple, because the government does not pay them well. They try to cut their budgets, but still they enjoy certain number of porters. So head porters have to be responsible for recruit sufficient porters, especially in times of like war, in the Sino-French War. And they also were liable to any missing items. So that's why I mentioned the head porter Tsai Jinfa. He was responsible for locating all those items. So now you understand the public service is not a good opportunity for them. So they try to evade such responsibility. By evade, I mean literally evade such responsibility, because head porters, they relocate to other counties in order not to be selected. So the government tries to create financial incentive for them, but the government does not have money. So he tried to allocate local resources like monopoly for operating between the harbor and the city, or other like the right to collect revenues from local shops. But local people headache. So they have, in one case, they accuse head porter as extorting the local people in front of the provincial government, not the county government. And one head porter even get executed. So you can understand why the government might not be able to find enough porters in a time of war when the demand is very high. Next slide, please. So Tsai Jinfa assumed the position right after his predecessor was executed. So this is a time of extraordinary time. And Tsai was not a random person, so he was accused of kidnapping some people. But here I point out this fact is that at that time he was accused of organizing a large group of porters try to intervene in a marriage dispute. So by this we can say that Tsai was already in this business years before the war, and Tsai tried to shift his financial obligations to local businesses. So he asked the county government to help to ask local business to provide porters instead of Tsai collecting fees from those shops. Remember, Tsai's predecessor was executed. So So this is kind of a lot of local details, but in the end, during the war, the government, in addition to utilizing Tsai's help, they also asked the county government, each department inside the county government to provide porters. And also the neighborhoods has to contribute porters. So it was in this ad hoc arrangements that wartime transportation was possible at this time during the war. But we might overlook such fact if we do not look at the local archives. Next slide, please. Very shortly, I just want to say that the war did not end between porters and the government, did not end between military and the rivals, adversaries. There's a war reversement war between the magistrate and the military. So very short, this is also linked to the problem of porters, because magistrates had to pay those porters in advance because the demand is high and people don't want to serve the government in times of war. It's a higher risk. So the magistrate paid the porters in advance and get reimbursed from the military. But the reimbursement is complex at this time because there were at least two sources of funding for reimbursement. The first is that the reimbursement will be handled by the military unit, which hired porters to carry their belongings of the troops and also help the transportation of the military. And another source is the central logistic apparatus in Taiwan called Liangtai. So in wartime, Liangtai. So Liangtai will be responsible for the reimbursement of the transportation of equipment. So one is about personnel, one is about equipment. And the magistrates encountered a problem that they have to classify their expenses into such two broad categories. So which porter carry out the tax for Liangtai or for the military unit? This is kind of very arbitrary criteria or requirement, which creates all kinds of problems for the magistrates to fight with the military. A lot of paperwork and long time and consume both the energy of the military and civil officials in wartime. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I just want to point out 2 points that by conducting such a research. So I think if we look at the local government society, we can see there is not a Sino-French war. Instead, there is many Sino-French wars because the war played out in the local settings, depending on existing local institutions, practices, and politics. So local conditions do matter here. And second, war was a constant for the history of Taiwan, at least in the late 19th century. So 1874-75 between China and Japan, 84 and 85 between China and France, 94 and 95 again between China and Japan, in addition to a lot of internal rebellions. So then we can think about the studies of history of Taiwan from the angle of understanding war as a constant in the life of people in this time and beyond. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, so I have to jump in just Nan-Hsu to say, I just loved that presentation so much. And boy, you certainly answered my question. I mean, the idea that, the grand arc of history kind of can be determined by the management of little tiny porters on the ground and the complexities and the, corruption and the whatever is just so fascinating. And it's so full of lessons for today, right? Because it's about humanity and the way you look at war and all that stuff. So thank you so much. I just want to make that comment. I don't have any questions. I just thought it was just wonderful. So thank you. Questions?
Linda,
Yeah,
Professor Wang has a question.
Could I have one question here? I'm truly not a historian, but I was really very fascinated by this talk. And I was just curious about the overall psychological turbulence that that probably affected the wartime participants, either the workers or the soldiers or the governmental officials and so forth. So primarily we were talking about the provisional side of the wartime supplies and transportations and so forth. In your research, have you discovered any, let's say, records about the effective responses of these workers toward the quote unquote the real war, and any issues about the fear, about the frustration, about any kind of the risky factors that may have affected the participants, the actants of this aspect of a wartime circumstances?
Thank you for Professor Wang. This is a great great question and important one. So historians work within the restriction of what sources allows us to say. But I think there are certain traces that we can see the effect of war on those people. So in the example I mentioned, the headquarter Tsai. So actually, he served the position for 4 years before the war ended. But right after that, he petitioned the county magistrate saying that my health is deteriorating. I want to retire. But I mean, there's a lot of work. Every other day he has to manage those shipments and also be liable for those missions, right? So I mean, there's half a year must be significant for his life. And also I think people are so resilient, because I found that Tsai, although he claimed to retire from the position, it doesn't mean that he retired from the industry. So he served as porters, contractors, private ones in Hsinchu County for another 10 years before he may disappear from records. So I think there are a lot of ways that we can assess the effect of war on people's life, on civil service life, on the military personnel. And I think that's something I would like to pursue in the long run. And thank you for your question. I think that's a great one.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to suggest one thing. Yeah, go ahead. Steve.
The adaptability of the Qing Dynasty to the late 19th century. Lots of writings about what the Qing Dynasty was capable of and not capable of, where the vulnerabilities were. What is this little picture of the relationship between the magistrate and the porters? What does that tell you about the weakness of the Qing Dynasty, or maybe its strength in responding to the challenge of war?
I think this is a great question. And actually, this is the current debate of this field of study, because scholars especially shouldn't debate about the strength and weakness of the empire. And I think if we look at the local archives, then I think the piece of information I present tells that how things happen, right? There's a war and military transportation needs to be accomplished. And it was those porters and also the ad hoc arrangements by those magistrates with little budgets make it happen. So when we look at the front line, we see soldiers and equipment were sent there. But when we look at the local archives, we see the process, how it happened. And I think the process would be different in different locales, in Southwest China, in Southeast China, in North China. Things happen, even though the end result is similar, but how it happened in the first place could be different. And I think it kind of complex our understanding of the empire, because we use the empire, we talk about the strength and weakness, but we should look at the multiple components of the empire.
I love that idea that it complicates the story of history, that it complicates the history. Yeah, I think you have a historical novel coming, honestly, it's a wonder, you've got so much color and detail and texture on the specific personalities, including the guy saying, my health is deteriorating, I don't want to do this anymore. There's a great historical novel there, so something to think about. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, our final presentation is also incredibly exciting and very, very different. Today we have Chia-hung Tsai, who's our visiting scholar and Fulbright Fellow this year and a professor at National Chengchi Dashi. So you're going to talk about American opinion on AI competition between the U.S. and China. So we're going to fast forward to contemporary times.
22 seconds.
Thank you, Chia-hung.
Okay, thank you for having me here. So today's subject is a little bit different from our studies because I'm going to share some research results from the class I've been sitting in this semester. So when I was sitting in Stephen and Solobi here class, he offered the class a chance to do a research, to do a survey research, and he actually hired internet survey company. I think it's Harris Interactive Post. So we designed a questionnaire. Unfortunately, the questionnaire cannot be too long, so we only have like 5 or 6 questions for each one of us. And but it's a real deal. I mean, they really collect like 1,500 cases for people's final project. So it's a very good data. But later something happened to the data. I will tell you later on. So let's move on to the topic. So the reason why I want to share the results is because the competition between China and the United States has lots of implications for Taiwan, and compared to these two superpowers, Taiwan has some relative advantage, but in terms of population and GDP economic wise, Taiwan is much more smaller. But I think looking at the future, we really want to know which country will be ahead of the other one, and Taiwan can think about the next step. Okay, next slide, please. So there's the outline here, and next, please. Next, please. Okay, so to give you more motivation about this research, so we know AI, machine learning, algorithms are very common in our daily life. So we have GPT, we have a Siri, right? And we have our main car, our main vehicles with lots of AI technology to enhance our security. And,
I don't see what I'm
because yeah, that's what happened, right? Right, very embarrassing. Right, and so all the idea about AI maybe can be transferred to like 25, 26 years ago, and you can see the Deep Blue designed by IBM defeated the World Chess Championship. Kasparov is a Russian, right? And Kasparov.
Right, Kasparov, yeah.
Look very frustrated because the first time man versus machine, and the machine got the But so the implication is that the machine can figure out lots of strategies that a human can never thought of. Right? Okay, next slide. Okay, next slide. All right, so my research questions are, how do Americans perceive AI in general? And will information about the competition between US and other countries will have any impact on policy preference? I want to stress this point because when we are interested in some policy or some idea, we want to know if people want the government to spend more money on this policy. But when you are asking people whether or not you want to what level you want the government to spend on this policy, people may say, "Oh, you can spend whatever you want, as long as you don't want to, you don't raise my tax, right?" So it's not so. I mean, this kind of question doesn't have lots of validity. So if you want to ask this kind of policy question, you want to ask, okay, so here's still, if you spend lots of money on this policy, you may spend less on that policy, such as social welfare, education, and other things. But in terms of AI or other new technology, maybe people still don't have any concrete idea about the compromise between technology and other policy areas. So you want to say, oh, if we are competing with other countries, and this country is doing very well, are you willing to spend more money on this technology or this policy? And so the basic example is China is really in certain measures is leading United States in AI. Of course, you can imagine other stuff like missiles or other technology, and but let's focus on AI in this research. So the final question is: does partisanship have any impact on AI policy preference? I mean, if this kind of technology or like previous vaccine or other medical stuff is also decided by people's partisanship, we will say, oh, it's politicalized, right? It's not science anymore. It's politicalized, and it's not about whether or not we should do it. It's about whether or not my party wants to do it, right? So there's lots of policy implications. Okay, next please. Okay, so as you may know, AI is driven by private sectors and universities. And of course, I think the Ministry of National Defense also invests in AI, but you can think that China has bigger population and market than the United States. And they also use AI extensively for domestic surveillance. So China, I think the Chinese government invests a lot in AI. And but there's some drawbacks in development in China because the language. I mean, in China they use Chinese most of the time, but in Western world they use English. So if you use the data collected in China, you may not, translate to English, right? And so the competition may be. It's not so balanced. Okay, and the United States and China are in very close competition to develop the supercomputers, because if you have supercomputers, you can do lots of neural networks and AI, machine learning. So it's very important that you got to have very good superpower technology. But right now, the United States is strangling the chucking the throat of China to make sure that they don't have very good chips and very good talents to develop those kind of superpower computer. And in 2019, according to CSI's Federal IPO, World Intellectual Property Organization reported that China has filed 1.4 million patents, or 43.4% of world's total patent application that year. So you can see that it's kind of like indicator that China is leading United States. Of course, the patent application doesn't mean quality. Maybe 90% of the patents are now useless, are not working in the market. But in terms of quality, maybe quantity may change the quality, right? So the competition is going on here. Okay, so in terms of theory, I think next please. I just find some literature regarding how people use AI. So for example, it's found that the mass public has only partial knowledge of what AI is. So when you talk about AI, you think lots of applications, but it's not easy to define what AI is, right? And the public learn AI through social media, and you can also see personality may have some correlation with the level of trust in AI. Okay, and it's also found that people in East Asia have greater trust in AI than other countries. I don't know why, but is it related to personality or related to level education, or just enthusiasm for technology? And then finally, in the US, only about 60% of people use by law enforcement to ask securities to phrase. Right. So United States people are still trying to adapt into the new technology in, for example, law assessment. Okay, next, please.
We have about 10 more minutes.
Okay, right. Okay. Okay, so let's see the data, and I've already talked about it, and let's move next one. Okay, so most of people, like 40% of people, think AI will make their life worse. Okay, so I think it's like a psychology of Americans about AI right now. Okay, next one. So I want to use the survey experiment by splitting the sample into half. So next one. So the first group of people will receive the treatment, which is China is leading the world in artificial intelligence patent filing, and the other group will receive this message that the United States is leading. Okay, and I want to know if there are any difference between these two groups in terms of the response to government spending on AI. Okay, next one. Okay, and that's the cases in these two groups. Okay, this one. Next one, yeah. And those graphs just show you the two groups are quite balanced. I mean, in terms of demographic variables, they are quite similar. Okay, so the randomization works. Okay, next one. Okay, next one. Okay, so in terms of spending, so you can see if you receive the information that China is leading, you will have higher level of spending on AI. Okay, and this one. So I also do t-test, and it's found that it's only very weak, not very weak, but not very strong evidence that the two groups have different idea about AI spending. So the p-value is 1.9, and the p-value is it's bigger than 0.05, but smaller than 0.1. So it means if you run the experiment 100 times, you can reject the hypothesis maybe 10 times. Okay, next one. And I also want to make sure that those treatment effect is not artificial. So I run multivariate model to test those hypotheses. Okay, next one. Okay, so there's the regression model, and next slide. And here are the coefficients. So you can see if I often hear about information about AI, I probably will support more AI funding. And then if I believe that AI will make my life better, I would also like to see more AI funding. And if I am Republican, I probably will not support AI spending. I think the reason why is that because it's probably because right now the Biden administration is still giving China a hard time in terms of technology. So if I am Democrats, I might follow the Biden administration and saying that we need more AI funding. And I also have an interaction effect. So the effect means that if I am Republican and I heard China's leading, I probably will not support too much AI funding. But on the other hand, if I am Democrat and I also heard China's leading the information, I will change to this way. I change the other way. I will support more AI funding. It's just flip side, just okay. Conclusion. So, for example, first of all, more Americans think AI will make their life worse than people that think AI will make their life better. I think it's very important because if most of people don't think AI is important or AI probably will make me lose my job or make my life very complicated and very difficult, I probably will not support too much AI, right? And it's not a good thing for a country they want to develop AI. And find weak evidence about the information effect. And the information about AI and expectation about AI have positive impact. So if the government wants to increase people's support for AI, maybe it's necessary to increase more communication or increase more, to get people know more about AI is very important. Finally, I think Americans still rely on partisan cues, but maybe they also use their expectation about AI to decide their policy preference. However, 40% Americans think AI will make their life worse. So it's not. So if still lots of people think AI is not a good thing, then people may not support AI too much. Okay, I think that's it. Next slide, and I get some other research features within the existing data. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you. Okay, questions?
It's just utterly fascinating. Thank you so much for that. And so many questions. I'm wondering, so did your work show that the 40% of Americans who think that AI will make their life worse, are they opposed to spending more money on AI? Is that what your research shows? That they don't want to spend more money on AI research?
Well, according to my regression model, if you think AI will make my life better, I will support more AI. But on the other hand, right? So relations, there's positive relationship between thinking about AI and supporting AI.
But that means that they're not really thinking about competition with China. They're thinking more about their own life. The effect on their own life, right?
To answer your question, I have to I need the interaction between life with AI and the treatment.
Right.
Right now, I only have the partisanship and the treatment, but it is easily done. I can do it this afternoon.
Interesting.
Right.
Wow.
But I guess Yeah, I should do it, right, yeah.
It'll be interesting. I'd be curious to know, yeah.
Yeah.
Are there questions online? I'm curious as to how you plan to use this research. You know, what's the next step?
Next step, yeah, presumably I should submit the results to either a think tank website or academic journal. But latest funny thing is that we find lots of weird response to other questions. And then we wonder there are some chatbots. I mean they are not real person. They just fake account number and fake account, and they do it for some incentive, and they kind of like screw out the data a little bit. So we still need to clean the data, make sure all the respondents are real people. Right. I think it's one of the problem we are facing when we are doing internet survey, right? Because you don't maybe you don't recruit the people you recruit are not real people. They're just some AI chatbot, and it's kind of data issue there. But after clean the data, if the treatment effect is still significant, I think I can try to submit a paper to Scott academic journal.
Other questions? Are there questions online? From online audience?
Was there anything that was counterintuitive that came out of this survey?
Counterintuitive.
Anything that surprised you?
Surprised you?
That surprised me. Not really, but of course I hope that the treatment effect will be a little bit stronger, and yeah, surprised me. Maybe I thought Americans are more positive about AI than I imagined, right? But it doesn't. It doesn't. It's not the way we think. Yeah, please.
We've done something about the impact on the global political structure because of the competition between U.S. and China.
Global impact.
Yeah. Especially the political structure.
Right. So, right. So if China continue to be in this AI technology, I don't know. I mean, maybe people will use will not use ChatGPT, like they will use Chinese version of ChatGPT, and I think there's huge impact. Just like people like TikTok, right? And so American government and politicians are discussing whether or not we should ban this kind of entertainment, right? But it's not easy, right? But if we are not using ChatGPT, instead we are using ChatGPT or Baidu GPT, right? That will be very, very different world. Yeah, because when we are using ChatGPT, we are actually giving data to AI for more machine learning, right? And you can, I think ChatGPT, I don't know, it's not making money right now, it's not making profit right now, but they were huge potential after they get more and more data on daily basis. Right.
Thank you.
Okay,
so
thank you.
much. I just wanted to thank all three of you so much because I mean, wow, this certainly shows the breadth and depth of the scholarship that our scholars are doing on Taiwan and broader issues. I mean, from film and how to live an ethical life and power dynamics in the classrooms of Taiwan to wartime history and the importance of the common man in the Qing Dynasty in Taiwan to U.S. China AI competition. We pretty much covered everything I can think of. So thank you so much for the broad, fascinating, presentations. Just wonderful. Congratulations. Wonderful.
Thank you to our online audience as well.
Yeah, thank you for joining online, everybody. That was great. Okay, we need to have a brief, I want to have a group